everyone. We're glad to have you today. It's great to meet you. I'm Mary Stimson, and I work for Southwest Airlines as a big data analyst. Today, we're going to discuss the challenges and strategies to overcome the challenges in adopting and scaling data models across each of our respective organizations and just in general. For many of this, for us, we are kind of on the leading edge of whatever our companies are doing in data science. And so the opportunities we have are boundless, but sometimes we have to kind of push the bar a little bit on how we can overcome those challenges. So we have some awesome panelists today. I can't wait to introduce them and hear what they have to say. But before we do that, I do want to say that our panelists are not representing their organizations, just their own opinions. And also before we introduce them, I do want to say that this should be more of a conversation than anything. So hopefully people will be active in the chat, drop questions in the Q&A, and I will try to jump in and ask them for our panelists. So for each of us, would we go around and introduce yourselves, a little bit about your background, where are you joining from, and what do you do currently? So we'll start with you, Charles.
Okay, thanks, Mary. So hi, everyone. I'm Charles Duze. I currently am at Meta, formerly known as Facebook. I support a team of managers and ICs in product analytics within the ads organization. We focus primarily on the advertiser experience, trying to identify bottlenecks and friction, both with experience and revenue. Prior to Meta, I previously led data science teams at Shopify, Comboy, and Zillow. And I spent the bulk of my career, about 14 years at Microsoft, starting off as a software developer in test, then data engineering, and then eventually data science.
Thanks, Charles. And I'll pass it to you, Anshul.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning based on the time zone. My name is Anshul Agarwal. Currently, I work at Walt Disney Company in Orlando, Florida. I lead a team of, we call decision scientists. This group is called Disney Decision Science and Integration Team. We are a center of excellence. We work with various different divisions or segments within the company. So we have media side, we have parks, and then we have the studios, which makes movies and all. So we work with all of them on different kinds of marketing problems, revenue management and pricing problems, ad sales problems, a lot in consumer products and games and publishing space also. So we develop all kinds of decision science or data science and optimization models. Prior to Disney, I've worked in different companies. My background is chemical engineering, but more so in operations research. I worked at Dow Chemical, as an IC on different supply chain production planning problems. From then on, I was in Chicago. I worked at United Airlines, then a couple of short stints at smaller companies, so Trunk Club, which was acquired by Nordstrom, and Home Partners, which is a part of Blackstone in real estate / finance. That was my last stint before I moved to Walt Disney Company. And so this topic of this panel is like, it's pretty close to my heart because I've seen different adoption models across different companies and different challenges. So it'll be interesting to share all those insights.
Thanks, Anshul. Appreciate that. And I'll pass it to you as well, Leondra.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leondra Gonzalez. I work for Microsoft as a senior data and applied scientist, and I'm based out of Indianapolis, Indiana. And I work on the GTM team, particularly in business insights. So we focus on propensity modeling, targeting, and business development, sales measurement. Prior to that, I'd like to say I get my starting in the advertising and digital marketing field. I've led teams in data science, particularly with digital marketing for a number of brands. And before that, I was also an individual contributor in the advertising, digital analytics measurement space. Aside from working at Microsoft, I'm also an entrepreneur. I have a side business where I focus on data and AI literacy, which can entail mentorship as well as corporate leadership and data and AI training. And I'm also a part-time PhD student. So I focus on information technology and data science. And my background is primarily in business analytics and statistics.
Thanks, Leondra. And last but not least, Francisco, would you kick us off?
Yeah, hi, nice to meet everybody and thank you for having me. I am Francisco Rius. I am the head of data science and data engineering over at Minecraft. Minecraft is part of Xbox Game Studio, so I also work at Microsoft. My team is responsible for data and insights end-to-end, so anything from the capturing of data, the data pipelines, data engineering, building analytics environments, as well as the data science and taking insights to decision makers to make player experiences a little bit more fun. Before joining Minecraft, I was at Electronic Arts for about 7 or 8 years, and where I was a director of analytics for the FIFA video game, as well as other sports titles like NHL and UFC. So I've been in video games for about 15 years, and in analytics and data science for most of my professional life.
Thanks, Francisco. And I guess I should say also, I said that I'm an analyst, data analyst at Southwest Airlines. I'm also a data application developer. My background is in a few funny different things, accounting, brand planning, ministry. And so I kind of fell into data science as many of us do. We have an industry that's filled with people from across different areas and fields of the world. It's one of my favorite things about data science is you can really come from anywhere. So that's me. And while we're at it, I would love to hear in the chat where others are from, where you're chatting from, what you do, and what brought you to the conference today. I'd love to hear that as well. So let's jump on in. We are all here to learn and better ourselves as we're deploying and scaling models at our organizations or just in general. But like I said, with many things in data science, sometimes we're kind of on the leading edge of that, and we have to kind of pioneer that within our company. And so I would love to hear from you, Anshul. What are the most common challenges that you've faced or organizations face when adopting and scaling data models?
Yeah, that's a very, that's the first question that'll come to anyone's mind. What kind of challenges do we face? Like throughout different projects I've worked on or I've led, the challenges have fallen in different spaces, I would say. Like if I look at a project life cycle or a timeline, broadly, I can see it falls into, say, a pre-sales phase where we have to like get businesses buy-in into whether that they want to go for a data model or not, and why they should change the practice or the way they're working today. And then there's the development part, where the challenge comes more in the trust part of whether they trust the results or not. And after that, it's integration. Once you overcome that, like how do you integrate in the business process? And finally, we call it sustainment, or like as a project goes along, is it following how the business is changing, or how the business is following? And each of these phases, I've seen different challenges. So in the pre-sales, it's thought about, as I mentioned, it's selling the idea or like supporting the, hey, why they should go for a data model or a machine learning model or analytics-driven framework, and how do they change what they're working on. So it requires different skills there. I guess the most important part is the development part, or the trust part, where the challenge comes at, hey, okay, they know you can build a machine learning model, but how can they trust the results? Or if you're giving one number or one prediction or one set of decisions, they would like to see, okay, if it doesn't align with their insights, how can we build trust in what we are building? And then the integration part is like other sets of challenges that, okay, we have a model, but how do we integrate with their core systems? There could be that aligns with some of the data related challenges, or integrating with their systems versus our systems that we're using to build. And final challenges are more on, okay, how do models stay up to date? How do they mirror what's happening currently? If the business rules change or the external dynamics are changing, how do we make sure that the models stay current or they stay relevant? So these are like high levels of challenges that I have seen. But yeah, happy to see what other panelists also think.
Thank you. And I will pass this to Francisco, because I'd be curious as well what you experience at Minecraft of various challenges in deploying and scaling.
Yeah, I want to echo a couple of comments that Anshul made earlier around what he calls the pre-sales process, which is really getting the buy-in, but identifying a need is really, really important. And I think one of the places where there's a challenging, especially in creative industries, on basically starting a relationship where creative industries sometimes may have a tendency to trust their gut to make the decisions. And the educating component is really, really important. I think there's also a very strong exploratory component where data science and analytics teams have to learn the context by doing data exploration. And a lot of times that comes in the form of having to explore raw data or acquiring data from external sources to really identify the need that, as Anshul very eloquently pointed out, sometimes we have to put our sales hat on and go out and partner with people to explore that need and potentially move towards execution. So I think that's a pretty big component. I think in a general sense, acquiring subject matter expertise is really important when we are moving to different projects in a large organization. Generally speaking, most data science organizations and analytics teams are probably 3-4% of a large organization. So we don't have big teams that can basically scale to every single project in an organization. So how do we build people that can understand the context in each of the different phases? So I think that's a big part of it. And then once a project is up and running, not losing trust. There can be data quality issues, especially when there is advanced modeling in place, when there's AI and ML intersected. And if something just looks off, making sure that we're able to diagnose, interpret results, and learn fast. So I think those are some of the areas that I see as opportunities when scaling into a larger organization.
Thank you. I appreciate that, especially a unique perspective coming from a creative industry specifically. We do certainly see unique challenges in that I'd love to ask you about later as well, Francisco, in our panel. So I'm going to pass this one to Charles. The question being, how can organizations ensure that our data models are aligned with the business goals and objectives? And I think Francisco and Anshul started to speak to this about sometimes we have to we're always connecting with the business, and how do we do that effectively, making sure we're not going off path and they're not going off scope either?
Well, thanks, Mary. And you rightfully said, both Anshul and Francisco, this really connects with everything they shared earlier. I'll recommend maybe 5 or 6 steps in thinking about this. The first is really trying to understand the data alignment of your org. Sort of where does your org sit when it comes to data? This may even be a pre-step to the sales process, just knowing what the current state is. And so for many orgs, they are already very aligned with data. They won't make any decision or wouldn't move forward unless they have data in place. On the other extreme, you have some orgs that are very adverse to data. They don't trust it, they don't rely on it, or whatever the reason may be. Most likely, many orgs fall somewhere in the middle. Maybe data is fine, but maybe it's an afterthought, or it's a nice to have. Anyway, somewhere in that spectrum, understanding where your org falls in the spectrum really helps you to tune your approach as you go further down the process. The second thing I'll recommend is understanding the business objectives and the opportunities. Just like Anshul and Francisco shared, most businesses exist for a very specific reason or a very specific objective. Rarely is it to build data models, but the data models can serve. And so trying to understand what the real business objective is, why do we exist as a business? And then translating that down even from not just the business, but to the specific org or the specific group that needs the data model, and being able to really understand and frame things in terms of the business problem. What's the business problem we're trying to solve? Once you're able to define that, it comes into the third step, which is actually confirming that the data model is the right solution at the right time. In many situations, depends on how early. Like Anshul said, sometimes we're just groundbreaking, it's very new. Maybe a data model may be too complicated a solution, and there might be a simpler model or simpler option to really help solve the solution. And even if that's the case, that's still okay. You're building credibility for future data models. You're building credibility by helping the business solve problems. You're building credibility by saying, you'll always pick the right solution for the problem. And then once you have that, the fourth piece is sort of expressing the data model as a solution. Many times we think of, once you've done your due diligence, many times we think of like the success of the data model is maybe the accuracy, precision, recall, NDCG, whatever metric we have. but it's taking it one step further to actually saying, what's the business metric that we're trying to move? How does this data model solve this? And how do we define success in terms of business and how the data model connects to it? So which ties into the next recommendation, which is thinking of the success metric. How do we know that this model is successful, and what's the metrics that we're going to use, or how do we evaluate that this is successful? It's important that to understand that this may also happen in stages. We may not go from 0 to 100 immediately, and so we may have a phase 1 of V1 and a phase 2 V2 and all of that. And at this point, it's also important not to this is going to solve everything in 5 minutes. Be realistic about what the data model is going to do. And then finally, I would say measure and iterate. And so if this is a phase 1 or 3 months, the first 3 months or 6 months, whatever the case is, once you roll out the data model, check the results, check the business metrics, and see, is it meeting the goals? If not, let's iterate. If it's meeting the goals, let's prepare for the next stage. At each stage of the process, just be realistic. Things don't always go according to plan. So be adaptable and sort of like figure out how do we adjust this? But at the end of the day, it's really trying to put on the sales or the business hats in addition to the technical hat, and then being able to express all the technical stuff, whether it's the solution, the model, the metrics, success, progress, through the business lens. And that just does help build a lot of credibility and create a lot of alignment with the business.
Thanks, Charles. I really appreciate that whole framework. I wish I need to take notes when I rewatch the recording, because I love that stepped framework. I'm also going to ask Leondra, would you weigh in on this as well, as how do we maintain a connection between the business needs and what we can provide when we're deploying and scaling models?
Sure. So I think the other panelists were very comprehensive in their responses, but I think I'll reiterate on 1 or 2 pieces, which is really focusing in on the strategy and the business goals. So I think sometimes we forget that analytics is very much a functionality that exists within an organization. And in a lot of cases, one might say even in most cases, those folks aren't necessarily the subject matter experts at what they're trying to solve. So I think in order to establish that trust and to establish the baseline context that you need, there needs to be a strong relationship between the stakeholders as well as the ones who are performing the analysis. In a lot of cases, information technology should be pulled into the conversation, because we might not even be at a place where we're collecting the data that we need to even begin to solve the problem. So understanding the business strategy, the business goals, as Charles mentioned, understanding the KPIs or the metrics that we're trying to move, and then ensuring that there is an open and transparent relationship between the stakeholders and the analysts, so that one side of the fence doesn't seem like like some enigma to the other side, which also goes to a point that one of the other panelists mentioned before, which is ensuring that we're even doing the thing that's necessary. So, it might not need the most fanciest model in the world, as long as the solution is coming from a place of business strategy instead of from how can we apply the fanciest model out there right now. I think you'll save a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources, and you'll get the most satisfactory result.
Thanks, Leondra. I know what I appreciated is that you said it doesn't always have to be the fanciest solution. I certainly have experienced times where we were asked for a data science model and we suggested an Excel spreadsheet. And that's not at all a dig on those asking for a data science model. It's just a conversation about what we have to add value. It starts with what should we be doing to add value. So I appreciate that comment a lot. And in fact, I'm going to pull it back to you, Leondra, because I think you started to lead into something. So what you began to talk about is not just how we can connect those 2 strategies, but also how we communicate across the 2. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some strategies for effectively communicating the value of the data model to the stakeholders? So not only aligning them, but also kind of educating, having that conversation.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually somewhat passionate about this topic because of my interest in data literacy. And so I think there can be either a conscious or subconscious desire to communicate things in a very technical way in the data science community. But when it comes to data storytelling and when it comes to speaking to the value of a model or some sort of solution or insights, it really boils down to the value that you're able to communicate. And so I think on the data analytics side, it's very important to ensure that you're making your insights very accessible and very, very digestible for people who might not be, very technical. And so I've come across folks who will get really technical, I think, because it sounds nice, or because they're just not used to communicating to business professionals. And so I think in order to establish that trust and in order to make sure that you're getting the information that you need to move forward in the analysis, you have to make sure that you're communicating what you're doing in a very digestible manner, using terms that those people are most familiar with, and maybe even pulling in some of those people during the development of the model or the dashboard or whatever you're working on, so that they can provide their insight and making sure that you're understanding. For instance, at my job, there's like a ton of acronyms, and many of which, I didn't understand because it's part of the business context, and you only learn it with experience. And so making sure that I'm jotting down those acronyms so I'm an effective communicator, and making sure that I'm providing, resources to business stakeholders as well, so that when I say something like p-value, maybe I'll give them a more layman terms or a way to understand it than throwing around that term. So just really being transparent and making sure that your content is digestible and accessible.
Yes, I love that, Leondra, and I love that you're passionate about data literacy. That's so important, especially in a conversation like this. And I'm going to weigh in for just a second because we have a conversation going on between Eric and Daniel in the chat. And Eric is asking, as sort of, he's called himself a nascent data scientist and the only one with data science experience in his organization, and on his team, how does he kind of effectively be the primary driver of let's move into these data science kind of projects and roles? And anyone is welcome to weigh on this, but I want to reiterate what Leondra said, which is the first thing is communicating really clearly, without jargon, without trying to, impress anybody, just making things useful to people. And the second, I think Daniel said this, or somebody in the chat, is making your teammates love your work. And sometimes, even if like Leondra said, the model doesn't have to be the shiniest, sometimes maybe your dashboard should. Maybe things should look really well and communicate stories really well. If you're trying to convince the business or the other side of the conversation that data science is a useful tool here, communicate stories well, and maybe try to make your partners love your work so that you can be a leading pioneer on that side of the field. So that's just my comment on that. I would love to hear from anybody else, not only on that topic, what Leondra said about communicating the value of data science, but also weighing in on Eric's thought about how to pioneer and kind of convince partners that data science is a great direction to go. So maybe I can pass this to Charles. What do you think?
Certain. Yeah, I think Leondra and you, Mary, you covered this very well. I would say, in addition to that, the way I think of our role is being the interpreter, right? And to be a good interpreter, you have to understand where the other person's coming from or what's important to them. And so in your org, if you're the initial or the first data scientist, many times the rest of the folks you're working with aren't thinking about things from a data lens or a data problem space. They're thinking about things from a business problem or a business space. And so if you're able to understand what that problem is, where the shoe hurts for them, right? And then being able to now convert that and say, here's how data, or here's how this model can actually help solve that problem. And so you have to first understand where they're coming from, understand their problem, interpret it or translate it into a data problem, and then translate it back into a business solution for them. And being able to serve this role as both the interpreter between data and business land, as well as the implementer, I think does help really build the gap or bridge the gap between data and business. And the comment about making them love your work, I think that can't be understated. It starts with like little bits, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's a result to a query. It's really like, I like to use the example of, it's the Costco sample, right? You give them a little bit and you're like, oh my goodness, where can we get more? How can we get more? You know, like really building trust in little bits, bits by bits. And before you know it, you're asking for a lot, and here everyone's coming and saying, hey, how can you help us? What can we do here? What's the data solution here, right? And so building trust, it takes time, but I would say the ingredients are really there. It's the interpretation, understanding things from their perspective, building trust step by step, making them love your work, and then just giving it patience and allowing things to iterate and evolve over time.
Yes, Costco samples. I'm going to use that, Charles. That's awesome. And in fact, I would, and I think you're unmuted already, both Anshul and Francisco. I'll pass it to Francisco now. You were talking about educating your business partners, especially in a creative field. Would you speak a little more to that and how you communicate and educate your partners within the company?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love the comments, and I particularly enjoyed the conversation around partnering with our stakeholders to together ramp up our literacy, both on the business context side, but also helping our partners ramp up on their maturity of using data. I find it very useful to go on a journey together with our partners, right? So the cornerstone to getting to advanced models and getting to AI and ML really is the data foundation, but also adding value through data. And I think the insights part of a data function is really, really important. And I think that's really the first step towards getting to more advanced use cases. In our example, one of the things that we found very useful is we actually have a rhythm of business where we have our analysts and data scientists sharing insights every single week with a few hundred people in the organization. And it's basically a way for our data scientists and analysts to establish a relationship with the studio and with the creative folks in a non-threatening way, but also to foster this piece that we've been talking about, communicating complex terms in very simple terms. Totally agree with what Leondra was mentioning around. I think there's for some reason, the data science community has a tendency to speak in very technical terms. And I think a lot of times when we share knowledge with each other, we share kind of the steps that we take to get to something instead of the outcome. And it's really, really important to establish a foundation and speak the same language. And taking approaches that are non-threatening, I think that's really important, especially in a creative world.
Thanks, Francisco. I appreciate that. Anshul, you're unmuted. Let's hear it.
Yeah, no, I guess most of the thoughts that I had have already been communicated by other panelists. I completely agree with Charles and Leondra on the importance of business metrics and KPIs, and also Francisco mentioned being able to speak clients or business language instead of always communicating results in like statistical metrics that we're used to think about. I guess to add, like one strategy one time we followed was we conducted like a long A/B test. So like there were like say few samples or entities that model was being used for. We kind of split, like some of them were getting recommendations from models, whereas others were still getting recommendations from the current business process. And those were compared one against the other. And this actually helped our clients build confidence that, hey, okay, the models are at least as good as what they are used to doing and not very different from their understanding of the business, or at least models are able to capture what businesses is able to think about. So that helps a lot, especially given the comment in the chat, like going as a single data scientist against industry experts with years of experience. So that helps bridge the gap.
Thank you. Thanks, panelists. So we have one more question before we do Q&A. But while we're talking about this question, I would love if you have a question you'd like answered in the chat, would you go ahead and ask that or put that in the Q&A section so I can see it when it's time to go through those. So one last question I'd love to hear from one or two of our panelists. In the same vein, we have models that we have communicated, we have them effectively collaborating with the business, but we have to make sure they're flexible and adaptable as the business needs change. So how do you do that? How do you maintain that flexibility and adaptability while still maintaining the original integrity and accuracy of the model? So I'm going to ask this question to Charles, if you don't mind chatting about it.
Sure thing. So I think Anshul actually gave a great lead-in for this earlier on. Building the model initially, one of the last or most important steps that we often tend to neglect is the maintenance of the model. Usually when we launch the model, we've done our due diligence, everything's right, everything's great, and then we launch it, we get the metrics, and we're happy. What tends to happen is that over time, for whatever reason, either the data or the inputs or for whatever reason, things do change. And unfortunately, in many cases, we actually don't allocate the time or the process to go back and maintain or to update the models. And so something that's critical is, as part of planning the model from the get-go, is sort of having a plan for what the maintenance is going to be, whose responsibility it is, what the metrics we're going to measure, or the thresholds, what's acceptable for the metrics, and then how we go back and adjust that. And I think being able to allocate this time and allocate this process actually will help a lot, because it's almost guaranteed that over time, models will begin to deviate. And if we fail to monitor them or have a plan to address or to revisit them, then we're probably setting ourselves up for I won't say disaster because that's too drastic, but we're setting ourselves up for the less ideal experience. And the key thing is with the KPIs, we should always have sort of the model KPIs or the model metrics, but also the business metrics. And as long as we're monitoring those, we're making sure that the model isn't one deviating away from whether it's the accuracy, the technical metrics, but also from the business metrics as well.
Yes, thanks, Charles. Oh, go ahead, Francisco, please do.
Sorry, I was just gonna add. I love what has been mentioned here, Charles, and I think Mary, you also touched on some of this as well. There's one strategy that I think goes very, very effective in making sure that our models stay relevant and flexible, and it's being lean in an analytics model, and also as an organization, creating tech stacks that are easy to use, and code that is easy to read by analysts. Pays out 10 times more dividends than writing something very sophisticated that only one person in the organization is going to read. And Mary, you touched on heuristics, but potentially being very useful when we're doing advanced modeling. And it's all true. I think generally speaking, a heuristic is going to stand the test of time a lot of times, but also it's going to be very easy to read. So don't overlook the value of simplicity and being lean in an analytics effort.
Thanks, Francisco. I appreciate that. Let's jump to Q&A if you don't mind. I would love to hear, what are the biggest problems from somebody when scaling models across very large data sets? And I think this is a great question, as we have lots of different fields in here. So what approaches have you used that have worked for you in that regard, and contributing? Somebody share your thoughts on that. Maybe we'll have one panelist for this so we can hit a couple other questions. Oh, okay, I'll tap somebody. How about you, Anshul?
So is the question around like scaling models across large data sets?
Yes, exactly.
So that's a great question. How, like, one approach that we have always taken is start small, or start with a POC, a proof of concept model. Like how we have defined when we work on projects is like have a POC and then pilot, and then once people see value from that, then we go to building models on larger data sets. So that way we have addressed the problem of scalability and not jumping in straight with the entire large data set or the entire problem space. So the problem could be either reduced in a spatial domain or time domain. Then you can address in a smaller way and see whether the models are credible and you have built an effective strategy to handle that before you go on. And then in terms of technology, today there are several capabilities, like going to a cloud platform, which offers compute space and other capabilities where you can test out your strategy across larger data sets. So you can take care of like smarter architectures to account for that, and like AWS or Google Cloud Platform or so many other cloud services, they offer capabilities to address that from a technology perspective. But yeah, from a mindset or philosophy perspective, that's the approach we have taken, like attack small and then prove and then go forward.
Yes, love that. Thank you. And I think you led us right into our next question, Anshul, about cloud services. So the question here is, I'll read it and then hopefully paraphrase it. What do you feel is the most common use case or business argument that offers the best ROI when moving a data system to a cloud infrastructure model versus remaining in-house? So if I'm paraphrasing that correctly, would be, when do you choose what models to move to the cloud versus maintaining on-prem or in-house? If I'm understanding that correctly, hopefully.
And I can start. Then.
Go for it, Anshul. Please do, yes.
I think one rule of thumb we have used, so one capability which clouds offer very successfully is the serverless capability. So, or the ability to scale the compute resources needed when the demand is higher versus lower. So if a lot of users are using your product or models, or if the compute time goes up, then you need to scale resources. So that can be done very effectively using a cloud service versus having on-prem. So that's one guiding factor that we have used. And yeah, I'll let other panelists also weigh in.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that the risk is mitigated of if one data scientist wants to run something very sophisticated, they won't take the entire ecosystem down because of that serverless architecture and being able to scale up and down. But also virtualizing data is really easy to do in cloud. You can bring in data sources from anywhere on the internet and beyond, and it's just really easy to plug and play and virtualize a meta store. Whereas on-prem relational databases become a little bit more important. So there's pros and cons, obviously, but also there's a lot of technology or advanced models in cloud in each of the cloud providers. So I think there's a few really nice advantages for data science in general.
Thanks, Francisco. I appreciate that. That's definitely the question on everybody's minds, right? When do we use the cloud and when do we not? So the following question I will address to whoever looks the most excited to answer it. And that is, please give an example of a problem that you had and how you addressed it with a specific model. So how do you decide on that model? Who looks the most excited? Charles, you win, and you look very excited.
Sure. One of my favorite examples comes from Shopify. At Shopify, we had an app store where merchants could go in and develop install apps for their websites. And one of the problems we had was with fake reviews. So just like on Amazon or hotel sites, wherever people rely a lot on reviews, and the app developers actually pay for fraudulent reviews. And so it's really challenging to tell which review is actually real and which review is fake. And the process we had at Shopify at the time was actually a manual review. So we had a team of ops folks who would read each review and try to determine if it's real or fake. The problem was that didn't scale. And so we actually came in with a solution to try to build a model that could help identify that. And we went through most of the stages we discussed earlier, like trying to understand the business problem, starting really small and all of that stuff. But what we did was we started with a really small, very simple logistic regression model. We didn't have a lot of training data, so we had to build that at the same time as we were building the model. But it was very simple. It wasn't as smart initially, so that was the phase one. But it allowed us to build the infrastructure, to build the processes, and to sort of build everything around it. And then once we had that, it was very easy to go in and replace the model and make it smarter and upgrade it over time. So sort of like with the theme of the panel so far, it's really been first we identified the business problem. We came in and showed how with the data model, we could scale much faster and maybe more accurately than humans. And then we started small and then started simple, like Francisco said, and then built everything else around it, built the process, built trust, and then we're able to evolve the model from then on.
Thanks, Charles. That's super interesting use case. And I always enjoy seeing that data scientists love talking about what they do because it's great fun. So unfortunately, we're kind of up on time. I know we probably have some other panelists that would love to speak to that topic, but I will leave this session open for the next 2 or 3 minutes. If anybody would like to answer in the chat, we'll probably go ahead and all come on mute just so we can let others go ahead and go to their next session, but let's stay active in the chat, panelists, if you're up for it, so we can answer other questions. There's some in the Q&A as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining. If you need to jump to your next meeting, please do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate it. you.